everybody. Welcome to episode 100 of the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm very excited to get to this point here. Almost 3 years after we started, we launched on May 1st, 2018 on the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker. And I guess that puts us at a little bit over 30 episodes a year. So not bad for a podcast that was supposed to come out every week. Didn't quite reach that goal. I don't have a lot to say on this occasion other than thanks to all who have listened. Thanks especially to all who have donated to help keep the show going. And I'm always very encouraged when I hear from people who listen. In particular, sometimes I hear that a number of mothers listen to this podcast. And that is almost the best compliment I could get on the show, because mothers are so important in transmitting culture that it makes me really happy and feel like I'm making an impact when I hear from mothers who listen. So thank you very much. God bless you for that. And, I wasn't sure what to do to celebrate episode 100. And at a certain point I thought, well, why don't I have someone back on the show who I've had on before, one of my favorite guests who I haven't who hasn't yet returned to the show. And so I thought of Samuel Hazo. Samuel Hazo was back on episode 28. He was a guest on the show. We discussed his book on Jacques Maritain, and he's back to talk with me again today for episode 100, and I'm really excited about that. Sam is a poet, playwright, fiction novelist, and the author of dozens of books, founder and director of the International Poetry Forum in Pittsburgh, the McAnulty Distinguished Professor of English Emeritus at Duquesne University, where he taught for 43 years. And to be perfectly honest, when we had Sam on before, it was just to talk about his book about Jacques Maritain, and he surprised me with reading so many beautiful poems to illustrate philosophical points we were discussing. Poems by him and by other great poets. Robert Burns, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and others. And that was a real delight. But coming back to this interview, where we're going to be primarily talking about his poetry, I was feeling a little bit intimidated because Sam has had a tremendously long and successful career at 92 years old, still publishing new books. And I'm only familiar with his very most recent work, other than the book on Maritain. So I did call in some favors and ask some other Catholic poets to suggest some questions for Sam. So just right off the top, I would like to thank, in particular, A.M. Juster, Jane Greer, who sends her love, by the way, Mike Aquilina, and Ryan Wilson, and for submitting questions. I won't be able to get to all of them, but they definitely helped to form my thoughts in preparation for the interview. And thanks also to Mike doubly for helping to get the technical stuff set up on the other end there. So that's a long introduction, but I'm really happy to welcome Sam Hazo onto the show. Thank you for coming on, Sam.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
Well, maybe we could go ahead and just start with the two most recent books that you've published. Both are from Wiseblood Books. I actually had the editor of Wiseblood on this podcast a while back, Joshua Wren, wonderful guy. I met you both at the Catholic Imagination Conference in Chicago at Loyola University. This was after I had interviewed you.
Yeah, where I met him myself.
Oh, really? Okay. So that was a great connection for both of you then.
Oh, yes. Very well.
So we will be talking primarily about your poems, but I also read your most recent novel. So your two books out from Wiseblood are a novel and your latest collection of poems. The novel is, let's see if I can get this right, If Nobody Calls, I'm Not Home, The Open Letters of Bim Nakeley.
That's right.
And the collection of poems is The Next Time We Saw Paris. You seem to enjoy having sort of confounding titles to your to your books.
Actually, Tom, these just came to me. They just worked out. And the epigraph to the title poem of the book of poems is The Next Time Was the Last Time. So when
Right.
when I wrote the next time we saw Paris, I deliberately put it in the past tense. The next time we saw Paris was the last time.
Well, I have a friend of mine wants to get the book just because the title was so intriguing to him. It's such kind of a startling, way of
May,
putting it.
may his tribe increase.
So actually, you know what? Didn't intend to ask this, but while we're on the subject, I'm kind of curious what drew you to, what made you decide to publish a couple of new books with Wiseblood in particular?
Well, the reaction I had to what they were trying to do was very strong, because when people speak of the quote Catholic imagination or the Christian imagination, that to me is a new road. You're no longer writing catechetical literature. You're no longer writing promotional literature. You're no longer writing evangelical tracts and so forth. You're letting the imagination speak for itself. And I was very impressed with Joshua and with his associate down there, Louis Maltese. And I sent them the books, and the next thing I knew, I had 2 books published inside of a year. It was amazing. And I have another book with them that I'm even more hopeful about, called I Want It to Happen. It's a love story to prove, I shouldn't say to prove, to show that love at its best is when nobody thinks it's possible.
Is that a novel as well?
It's a novel. Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. Now, how many novels have you written?
Counting 2, 3, 4, 5.
5. Okay. So you're better known for poetry, but you're certainly, Bim Nakeley was not your first novel. I read that. I finished it a couple days ago, and I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to talk about it up front because we'll be focusing on the poetry for most of this. But I really enjoyed it as just a window into somebody's mind. Not necessarily the most eventful life, but at first you start reading it and you kind of think, oh, that's cute, and then you get really sucked into her psyche, as the book goes along, and it's a collection of her letters to people dead and alive, but or people she's never met at the very least.
It's essentially a epistolary novel, but more importantly to me, it's actually based on my aunt. Because
right.
After my mother died, when my brother and I were just under 6, my aunt stepped in and raised us. And she never married. She just was the most amazing woman in the world, and frank, absolutely frank. I mean, she didn't. I came in once, I remember I had worked and I'd saved enough to buy a suit. So I came in, I put it on, and I said, Cac, how do I look? She said, you're not ugly, but blue is not your color. That was the total comment. And that was a compliment. That was a compliment.
Yeah, well, so I looked at your Wikipedia page the other day. I read the novel not knowing that this was related to your own aunt, or your own life at all.
No reason.
And then I read your Wikipedia article, and in the biographical details, it mentioned you being raised along with your brother by your aunt. And I thought, okay, so this is a very personal. Of course, all your work is personal, I'm sure, in some way or another, but in a sort of explicit way, personal. Yeah. So did your aunt actually take upon herself this exercise of writing letters to historical figures, celebrities, the Pope, etc., or is that just a way of getting into her?
That was simply a technique. She wrote. She had a notebook, which I found only recently, and she had notations in there. Never very long, just short quotations, and but they were all eloquent. every quotation said something. She had one very simple. She said, "I pray to God that I'll be with you always."
Hmm.
Period. If that doesn't move you, you're not
Yeah.
human.
Right. Right. So she's writing to presidents, to Abraham Lincoln's mother or his stepmother, to the deceased Pope John the 23rd, to Rita Hayworth, to Charlie Chaplin, and it's a really, and then to some of her family members, dead and living, and so it's a very interesting collection of people to really bring out her thoughts on various subjects, which may have possibly, you can imagine, may have gone unarticulated
Mhm.
otherwise.
Well, let's say it was her opportunity to get a lot of things off her mind to people whom she admired.
Mm-hmm.
So when she writes these letters, she doesn't hold back at all.
Yeah.
And she
And by
says
the end, whether or not you agree with her on everything, you think, well, this is a genuinely heroic woman.
she was, but she was frank about women. She was the letter to Mae West. She says, "You and I, you look like the kind of a woman that I could sit down with and have coffee and talk."
Mm-hmm.
She says, "Marilyn Monroe was not a woman's woman. She was a man's woman.
Mm.
I have a feeling," she said, "that she wouldn't be comfortable sitting with other women. But Mae West was different."
Yeah. Well, it was also interesting for me, having heard of all of the figures that she's written to, not necessarily being very familiar with all of them, but someone born in 1990, interesting to get a window also into the significance that some of these figures held for people at the time. Of course, I kind of know the significance that JFK held, for instance, but not
Yeah.
necessarily these various celebrities or even maybe Pope John the 23rd so much. So that was interesting. It's an interesting insight into a particular time. Maybe we can go ahead and read a poem, if that's all right with you.
Go ahead.
Do you think we could just start with the first poem in your new collection?
It's entitled "Once." Once. And I'm very fond of that particular word because there are many things that we take for granted. But if you think about it, everything that has happened to you, to any of us, happens only once. Getting up this morning happened only once. Having breakfast this morning happened only once. This is the poem. If once means once twice is impossible. Once is quick as a struck match, but once can be a song that keeps singing after it's sung, or a poem that's once and always at the same time. To be complete, it has to end, but once it's over, it begins again.
This poem really, so the book is divided into 5 sections,
Mhm.
and this poem stands outside of those sections. It's the first poem. It's before the first section begins,
It's an
and it
introductory. It's an introductory.
right. Yeah, and it really I've read few, well, I've read few poetry collections, period. I'm a relatively new reader of poetry, but of the poetry collections I've read, few of them have a through line as much as this does, with regard to that particular concept of the singularity of any particular experience or thing, and also and it's relevant to the creation of a work of art. It's relevant to our mundane experiences, and it's also relevant to the completion of a human life, where only when the life is completed is it sort of drawn into a unity, and you can make sense of it.
That's right.
Um, and that's another theme of your experience too, is sort of like how you find out things by doing them, or essentially,
And they
or
have
living
to
them.
end to be complete.
Yeah, and so I'm a musician, and I understand this idea of, because I think of music as an art form probably more than most others of the present moment. Um, Although now we have recordings, I suppose. But it's also something in which memory plays a large role, because it's your memory that links what you just heard to what you're hearing now, and then it's your memory which presents the work as a whole to you after it's
That's
finished.
all.
So you
Memory is all we have. Memory is literally all we have.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because most people think of memory as something that's kind of stuck in the past, but the way you present it in some of these poems, it's really something that binds all of experience into a present, into something that's still alive.
Any particular one that you think of? It's a dinner that I had with my wife in a restaurant by the Mediterranean years ago.
Oh, do you want to read that one?
It's called Night in the Eye of the Sun. And it was, when you're on vacation and you've had a hard time traveling and all that, suddenly you have one evening just to yourselves. So there was a restaurant in a town called La Napoule, right by the Mediterranean Sea. So we went there, and this is the poem that grew out of it. It's called Night in the Eye of the Sun. And on a pool with Marianne, I order mussels steamed with aioli, 2 cappuccinos, and a warm baguette with butter. It's almost dusk in La Napoule. 2 waiters are laughing in French and folding serviettes. We talk of Avignon and Aix-en-Provence, where thousands of sunflowers follow the sun to sleep and aisles of lavender look truer than they are. We say if colors can intoxicate, these do, and then some. It's darkening in La Napoule. We dine like partners who have earned the ease that work makes possible, and doubly bountiful because it's earned. Throughout America, where ease means laziness, that art is lost. In La Napoule, the night is ours to waste creatively. The buttered crust of our baguette tastes almost like the Eucharist. Tomorrow, fireworks will celebrate the fall of the Bastille before the coast grows calm again. The checked and anchored yachts will mute their lights. Beach crews will stack their sunning mats like so much stock. The sea that hides more history than all the oceans in the world will slow its tides. But that is still a sun away. Our private tables feels so much like home that we forget the time. It's midnight now in La Napoule.
I think of all the poems in this book, this one was the one that, for me personally, had the effect of drawing me into an experience and an atmosphere in a kind of a visceral way. In some of the others, I'm considering ideas, I'm considering images, but this one, for me, I got sucked right into it the most.
Several people have told me that. In fact, one woman just recently said, I enjoyed being with you in La Napoule at dinner with Mary. That's the way she put it.
That's great. And I've never been to France, and I have no idea what La Napoule is, but I was there nonetheless.
It's about a mile east of Cannes, small village.
I think my favorite line, though, is probably the one about, um, you know, being at rest, like, I'm misquoting here, but being at rest like partners who have earned it after a long labor.
Right.
That was the part that really sort of clinched it for me. I was like, okay, that I can
Well, that
feel this relationship.
it's. I mean, my wife died 5 years ago, so I can tell you frankly that eating now is not dining.
Hmm.
It's not dining. Dining
Yeah.
makes all the difference. You have to be with some other person or persons, or you're just nourishing yourself. That's all.
Yeah. And she's very present in this collection. Um,
As she should be. Yeah.
yeah. So I just remembered what poem I was thinking of with regard to memory in the past. It's actually the second half, the second part of your poem, "The Servitude." Would you mind reading that poem?
The second part.
You could read the whole thing, but I was thinking specifically of the second part.
All right. It's in two parts. Part one, and the epigraph to the poem is: the pen is a second tongue. Part one. Poems come all at once, or in stages. Jealous as love, they leave no room for distraction. A forced poem mimics a forced marriage. Failure is only a matter of time. Interrupted, a poem returns beyond denial, like a love that's chosen, conjugal, and undeniable. Similarities are obvious even when they seem far fetched. Asked if he believed in God and why, one widower said, I want to see my wife again. Part two. To remember wherever you were, whenever you said whatever was heard by whoever was with you, is just a distraction. Why do you think there's a past to remember? Time past is still present. Time present is passing. Time future will pass. You fret like poets who suffer to say what they alone can say. You wait for that moment to come the way a male cardinal waits for his mate, and she finds him.
Thank you for reading that. So yeah, it was the second part that I was thinking of with regard to our conversation on memory and the past. First of all, the first four lines are the second part of this poem, I believe, are my favorite on a musical level of the entire collection.
Oh, good.
Could you just read those four lines again so people can hear them again?
To remember wherever you were, whenever you said whatever was heard by whoever was with you, is just a distraction.
Yeah, it's got this like triplet rhythm that
Yes, it does.
that you don't always hear in poems, and I always really enjoy it when I do come across it. It's almost like bebop or something. Um, the other thing I wanted to mention about this poem is your little anecdote at the end of the first part. Asked if he believed in God and why, one widower said, I want to see my life again. This is something that comes up a lot in your poems, like little quips or quotes or anecdotes or references to something someone said. A couple of the poems are even just kind of collections of those. Uh,
That's right.
what is it that draws you about those little pithy things that you put in your poems?
Well, that particular quote was from a man who was asked once, "Do you believe in God?" And he said, they asked him why. He said, "Well, I want to see my wife again." Now, if you think about that, there are many people who think, for example, in the marriage service, they said, "Till death do us part." A lawyer wrote that. A lawyer. Period. It's not true because true mates, death does not part.
Hmm.
I mean, love does not It's so obvious. I mean, if love is as long as life, then love dies with death. But we have experience after experience where that's not true, where people for years or for the rest of their lives love someone who's gone.
Hmm.
Now, to me, that's almost an ultimate proof of God. I mean, why would, how shall I put this, a masochistic God put that impulse in people if it was unfulfillable?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And that's a kind of reasoning that is really not welcome in our time.
No, not at all. But Christianity is based on that very concept.
Right. Right. One of the poets I asked to suggest questions for you was Jane Greer, who reviewed this book in
Wonderful review.
in Literary Matters. Is that the name of the journal, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah.
Which Ryan Wilson edits, and I also had Jane on to discuss her own wonderful book of poems, which you wrote a blurb for, actually. So Jane had a question that's similar to mine, and I mentioned the structure of this book. I was hoping you could talk about the structure of the book, the 5 sections, and kind of how they work a little bit. Jane had a more specific question in regards to what you said on the dedications page, that a few of the poems were published in journals, but you preferred to not pre-publish most of them so that they could be read and appreciated first in the context of the book. So she was curious why you did that.
Well, there are many people, and I was one of them myself. When I published the book, you always like to have the credits in the front of the book that say a dozen or so of these poems were previously published in journals. That gives it a kind of prestigious feeling.
Hmm.
I didn't want that in this book. I wanted the poems to speak for themselves, whether they appeared in the Virginia Quarterly or the Hudson Review or the New Yorker or anything. To me, that was irrelevant. The poems should speak for themselves.
Hmm. You know, it's funny that, not being from the poetry world, I have the exact opposite impression when I read a book of poems or short stories and see where they were previously published. I think, what? I'm getting reruns here? So
Yeah, well, that's how I felt it would be. And I didn't want
interesting. So
that.
can you say a little bit about the structure of the book, the different sections in which it's divided?
Tom, I'd like to, but I really can't because the book fell into those sections almost by itself.
Hmm.
I just read and I grouped the poems in the ones that I thought not were thematically similar, but which, when you finished them, left you with a similar feeling. And I can't go beyond that. I mean, the in this one section, for example, the first part where the title is "To Be Reminded." To
Mm-hmm.
be reminded. There's a poem called "Who." Who? WHO? Question mark. Recognition's not the problem, but craving recognition is. Some bet on how they look, but banking on looks is fickle. Consider movie stars long past their prime and unremembered. The same holds true for those who make what's private public merely for attention. When something singular in private becomes plural in public, it loses all distinction. Distinction is what all wire walkers, astronauts, strippers, and assassins want. Assassins? Every president's assassin but one wanted to be known for what he did. Oswald was blamed for doing what was done and then denying that he'd done it. Murdered before trial, he'll always be guilty as charged for what he never admitted. Lone gunman, lone liar, or lone patsy. He changed a century.
It's funny how Oswald almost emerges as the hero of this poem in comparison to all the other people who are trying to get recognition in a bizarre way.
Well, recognition is not difficult. I mean, if Oswald will be remembered for the end of time for what he did with a rifle that cost him $14.99 from a mail catalog. And if you believe that he was the lone shooter, which I don't believe at all, where a man with a cheap rifle firing at a moving target and hitting it twice, that's asking a lot to believe.
Right.
There's a sister poem to this. The poem is called Thou Shalt Kill.
Okay.
And it has to do with something that I've come to accept reluctantly, and that is that we Americans now are, in some ways, a murderous people. I mean, in war since 1950, we've lost about 88,000 men and women in war. The number of wounded is 5 times that. We number, and I didn't believe this, 8,805 suicides a year.
Yeah.
Our homicide rate is, some say, but we'll settle for 26 a day, compared to 13 a year in Japan.
Right.
Owning a rifle or a weapon or a sword is illegal. Consequently, with regard to war, we tend to dress it up. You never go to war to kill. You go to save somebody. You go to save the government. You go to prevent worse things from happening. All these things. But what it comes down to is you go there to kill. And it has to be doctored up. So this is the poem that I wrote about that. Thou shalt kill. On D-Day alone, 10,000 died. Cemeteries in France commemorate them, grave by grave. The Battle of Tarawa lasted for 72 hours. 1,000 Marines were killed or drowned. Their bodies floated face down in the tide or sprawled half buried in the sand. Of 4,800 Japanese, only 17 survived. Nations rightly honor the lost, but killing is killing. When waged for honor and other deceits, war makes the killing likelier and lawful. Historians claim that Greece made war on Troy over a kidnapped wife named Helen. In fact, Helen welcomed the abduction. Paris was young and handsome compared to the braggart she married. Greeks would fight to save a kidnapped wife, but not one who loved her abductor. They settled instead for a plausible lie. Determined to trade on the Black Sea that Troy controlled, the Greeks knew war was the key, but only if seen as noble. Rescuing Helen of Troy from Troy is what their cause became. When dangers widen into wars, what worked at Troy still works, though Troy is off the map and Helen has other names.
Here's a question from Ryan Wilson, who I had the great pleasure of meeting also at the Catholic Imagination Conference. Um, he said, "You were the founder of the Pittsburgh International Poetry Forum and managed it for decades, bringing many or most of the great writers of at least two generations to your hometown. What was your goal when you established the forum? How did managing it affect your thinking about poetry? And do any of the forum's guests especially stand out in your memory, and why?"
Well, let's start with the title. I wanted it to be called a forum, not a center. It was a place where poets would be invited to come, to appear on stage, and to recite their poems to people who paid to hear them. That was the concept. Well, the first night we had Archibald MacLeish in the rain.
Wow.
The theater seated about 600 people. We turned away over 300 people in the rain.
Wow.
Then 2 months after that, we had the Russian. In fact, we were the ones who made possible Yevtushenko's coming to the United States because we, as the International Poetry Forum, invited him. Well, he came and they appeared in New York and all over the country, became world famous. But his first reading was in Pittsburgh at the International Poetry Forum. And then we continued. We had Nobel awardees, we had Pulitzer Prize winners, we had National Award winners, we had poets from 38 different countries. 38 different countries in 43 years.
Wow.
And I think it was a unique achievement, and I'm grateful to the people of Pittsburgh for supporting it. I'll always be grateful for that. They were terrific.
So Mike actually had a question about this as well. Mike, who's sitting off screen there, he wanted to know why international and not simply American. He wanted to know, what can Americans learn from poetry in other lands and languages?
Well, I think poetry is by definition international. By definition, I mean it's universal, or it's not poetry at all. One of the problems that, and I'm being frank here, one of the problems I have with many American poets now is that they don't transcend their circumstances.
Hmm.
They just don't. I mean, they either write for one another or for journals of their choosing. They write. There's one poet named Ashbery who's since died, whose poets, in my view, poems just defy credence, and yet he's won every award imaginable. There's too much of a gang mentality about modern American poets, and foreign poets like Yevtushenko, like George Seferis when he was living, like Seamus Heaney, who came to the Poetry Forum 3 times. The first time, nobody knew who he was. Nobody.
Wow.
Czeslaw Milosz, first time he came, nobody knew who he was. After he
Wow.
won the Nobel Prize, I invited him back. He said, I will come because you invite me before I receive the Nobel.
Wow. That's fantastic. So you found that foreign poets even today kind of resist some of the more insular, kind of confessional, identity group kind of and academic trends in modern American poetry?
Well, I can't say this, totally, but there are many poets in other languages which I read in translation, and they're as real to me as if they were speaking to me in English across the table. And that's the great gift that poetry has. I mean, it transcends, in a way, it transcends the language in which it is written.
So when Milosz came, was he reading translations of his own poems into English, or?
Yes, he read. He cooperated with Edmund Keeley in. Oh no, I'm sorry. Yeah, I have a mistaken. He and Robert Hass translated many of his poems, book after book, and he read the translations. He didn't. He didn't read in Polish.
I see. One of the recurring themes whenever I've interviewed poets on this podcast, in particular Dana Gioia, James Matthew Wilson, you, and a couple of others, has been the importance of hearing poetry read aloud, which obviously was central to the International Poetry Forum. Um, and this was honestly my doorway into poetry. I discovered another podcast called The Daily Poem, hosted by David Kern, and he just 5 days a week he reads a poem and he comments on it for like 2 minutes and then reads it again, and that's it. And it's very well curated. And just listening to a few of those completely changed. I've said this many times on the podcast, but it completely changed my relationship with poetry from something that I was intimidated by and felt that I didn't understand it correctly when I was reading it. I was afraid that I was missing something, and more something that I simply experienced in the moment as it was coming at me. And so I'm curious if that lines up with your sense of the importance of having people hear poetry rather than just reading it off a page.
Absolutely. I mean, poetry began before the printing press. Poetry was
Right.
spoken, and um, one of the liabilities of much modern poetry readings is that they're readings. I mean, a real poem should be heard as if it were a hearing, with no notes and no books, just the man or the woman reciting by heart what came from his or her heart.
Yeah.
So there's no interference. And that's, you find that among foreign poets, some, but it's not common in America. It's not common. You see somebody reading from a text as if you're reading from a phone book. There's almost no feeling in it at all.
Hmm. Yeah, this will be interesting because I just interviewed James Matthew Wilson again, and that episode will come out 2 episodes after the one we're in right now. But I also asked him about his philosophy of how best to recite poetry, to how to balance between the music of it and the kind of the emotion and the meaning. And so it's interesting to hear different poets comment on their approach to that. Um, you might be interested to know that I also just interviewed a guy, because you mentioned, poetry extending before people had writing. Um, I interviewed a guy who performs Beowulf in Anglo-Saxon. He sings it from memory. He does the first third, the whole part with Grendel, and it takes about 2 hours or an hour and a half. Benjamin Bagby is his name, and he's been doing it for about 30 years. He accompanies himself on an Anglo-Saxon harp, which
Yeah.
is reconstructed from harps that they found in ship burials, and it's absolutely fantastic. I saw him perform live, and it's with subtitles sort of on a screen behind him, and it's a really wonderful experience, and something that has been, you know, the kind of the sung poetry, the sung tale has been mostly lost. So um, I kind of hope that, well, to take it from another direction, I think you can see in throughout history a progression in which all the art forms which were sort of unified in the beginning, the Greek word for music refers to a lot more than what we think of as music today.
Music,
Um,
music is primary.
right. And as time goes on, you see the different art forms become sort of independent in the same way that the sciences kind of branch off from philosophy, and you finally get a distinction between science and magic and things like that. Um, so, for example, I'm most interested in instrumental music without words, and that just wasn't really valued until a couple of hundred years ago. most instrumental music was considered kind of ornamentation in previous times at best.
My son is a composer.
Right. Yes, I know. Yeah.
He
So
gets,
I go
he gets,
ahead.
I, the people that perform, I got on YouTube. I was looking for a couple of his songs. One recorded in Germany, one in
Mm,
Russia, one in Italy, and you see
right.
these little orchestras playing your own son's music
That's wonderful.
miles from where he created it. And but the same applies to poetry. I once wrote a very short 4-line poem. Uh, I'll say it, and it says everything that I want to say about poetry recitals. Since eyes are deaf and ears are blind to words in all their ways, I speak the sounds I write, hoping you see what somehow stays unheard, and hear what never is quite clear at sight.
That's beautiful. What I was trying to get to, I know I kind of rambled there, talking about the different art forms sort of gaining their own sort of autonomy, is that I think that had great value. I think that it had great value for instrumental music to develop as its own thing, separate from words and storytelling and things like that. But I kind of wonder if at a certain point there will be a reintegration. Of course, we have that with the liturgy. The liturgy, the mass, is kind of like the integration of all art forms into one. But I do wonder if the different art forms have become too specialized in a way.
Yeah, but you said the liturgy. Did you mention the liturgy a minute
I
ago?
did, yes, yeah.
The, the liturgy to me has gone to pot. I mean,
Well, sure.
since the abolition of Latin, I mean,
Oh yeah, of course.
everyone knows that there was never any music more suited to the human voice than Gregorian.
Right,
Gone.
right.
It's gone.
Yeah. Oh, I certainly agree with you there. Yeah. It's interesting, I love instrumental music, but I'm aware that most people like music that has words. And I'm just kind of wondering, if the reintegration of arts into, story, essentially sung tales, uh, or sung drama is not coming at some point, because the different art forms have gotten so fragmented from each other and so specialized.
There's no leadership. There's no artistic leadership at all. The liturgy is gone to pot.
Right. Let me ask you another question related to this. When I had the opportunity to hang out with Ryan Wilson in Chicago, we were talking about. I think this was maybe the day or the day after that you had your session there at the conference, and he was praising your work. And one thing he said that as your career had progressed, your poetry had become more and more like speech, but not in a prosaic way. But it is very natural, very direct, and very speech like. So, um, I have not, to be honest, I haven't read your earlier work like he has. But was there kind of a progression from? Did you start out in more kind of traditional formal verse?
Yes, we all did. Everybody did. It's the way you were raised, and then finally, the whole goal of poetry is eventually to have your own voice heard.
Hmm.
Just that, and you work at it until Dick Wilbur made a comment before he died. They asked him for a comment on a book of mine, and he said, "It is a stream of good talk."
Hmm.
And I took that compliment uh, to heart because Dick, in many ways, was the Mozart of the 20th century.
Hmm.
Dick's poems
Yeah.
were not good talk. Dick's poems were minuets. I mean, he could do he could make a poem like a ballet.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Held that held that against him. I admired him for it, even though there were poems. There was one poem especially that he wrote about a country he doesn't name. The name of the poem is Shame. But in this country, it's they want to be known for nothing. They don't know the population. They've never taken a census. And one day they rise up against the occupier, throw him out, and bring about the collapse of the whole empire. And I asked him once, I said, Dick, you should write more poems like that. And he smiled. Mozart is not easily distracted.
So you said that everybody started in your generation started writing in traditional forms. That is certainly not the case now. Somebody going through a poetry MFA program. I mean, I know people who have done this recently, and that's just not it's not the case anymore. So it's interesting to hear that that was the case when you were coming up, even after kind of modernism had and free verse had developed. Um, was that something that your generation had recovered? Had that been gone out of fashion, then come back into use at a certain point, or was this
No,
before?
I think most of the poets who are around my age, if they're still around, are very much formally interested in poems.
Hmm,
I think there's, and some of what is called free verse is just junk. I mean,
right.
I was talking to one person, said, well, don't, he was a young fellow. He said, don't you think if we use that word in a poem, it makes it more emphatic? And I said, well, I know that word. I said, I've been in the service. I've heard it a few times. And I said, do you know what it means? He said, well, everyone knows what it means. I said, no, etymologically, do you know what it means? He said, what does it mean? He said, it means to enforce or to fertilize. I said, if I use that where you would use the word, tell me how it sounds. Fertilize you. Get out of that fertilizing car. What the fertilizer are you doing here? Grammatically, it's stupid.
Right. I can hear Mike cracking up in the background there.
Well, this is,
Yeah.
I mean, people use, they think they're being emphatic, they're just being wrong.
Hmm. Yeah.
I've heard women read their poems at the poetry forum. They think nothing of saying that.
Does the poetry forum still exist?
Legally, yes, but we don't present. Well, I keep it in existence legally because we get requests time and time again. People who are writing biographies of a poet, they want to know what he did when he came to Pittsburgh.
I
And
see.
so I keep it in, but no, we don't present. We haven't presented a poet since 2009.
So that that speech like quality in your poems today, is that something that you consciously worked toward at all, or is that something that you knew early on that you wanted to get to, and were?
I worked on it, and I worked on it just today. I gave Mike a poem that I just finished, and it's an agony because to bring it down to what I want it to be, you have to eliminate so much scruff, so much
Hmm.
preference. And I was working on a poem. I'll read it to you here. It's called "The Fate of Nothing," and the epigraph is from Denis de Rougemant's book "The Devil's Share," in which he says the devil's first trick is his incognito. And this is the poem. Forget the pitchfork, the red pajamas, and the Satan sideshow. Save those for Halloween. What's diabolical reflects deficiency. Where we lack courage, the lack is devilish. If we lack love and let it molder into hate, the lack is devilish. When Omar Khayyam said, "I myself am heaven and hell," he meant that God and fate existed within him. It's always been like that. If we resist, we keep the devil at bay. If we succumb, the devil has his way with us. In case you've forgotten, the word evil hides within the word devil. It's more than symbolic. It's literally true and shows what's mocked us since the world began. Where some see losses, others see gains. Where others see pleasure, some see pain. No matter what we see or do, we're never certain in advance if what we do is right or what we see is true. What else explains why Abel noticed nothing in his brother to suggest his killer would be Cain? By then, it was too late for anything but hate and fate.
Was this the one you were saying was difficult to write?
That poem?
Yeah.
Yes.
So what was so difficult about it?
Just to make it work. I don't know if it works, but it's the best I could do.
Your poetry in general is very it flows very easily, and it's also easy to take in. It's not, there aren't layers of meaning, but it is easy to read, generally speaking.
I'm glad.
And I think that's a great thing. And also, to be honest, I've seen in many art forms that with age, with older artists, that's also something that develops. I mean, okay, so a couple of days ago, it was the birthday of one of the greatest jazz drummers of all times, Roy Haynes. Roy Haynes is 96 and he's still playing. And I was listening to stuff from him with Sarah Vaughan in the 50s. I was listening to stuff from him with Chick Corea in the late, who sadly just passed away in the late 60s. And then a concert at the Blue Note here in New York in 2019 when he was 95. And his groove is just so relaxed. It's like palpably relaxed in comparison to his younger playing. Not that it was tense before, but it's really the beat is like really wide and like breathes so much now. So that it was very interesting to hear that, and I just see that sort of like relaxed nature in so many artists who have made it across a span of decades and continued working.
Yes, I agree. It's amazing when you see it.
But that doesn't mean you're not still working, so to speak. Would you mind reading Unseen at Sight?
Unseen at sight. Sculptures of men in robes or uniforms or mounted on horses appear defiantly triumphant. Sprinkled with droppings, they're still commanding. King Zeus keeps aiming his spear. Rodin's Balzac scowls, while Dreyfus grips the broken sword of his injustice like a cross. Sculpted nude, the bodies of women command in silence. No crowns or robes, no uniforms, no horses. Forever in their prime, they wait in stone. They know their breasts and thighs are whispers destined to be overheard. No longer hidden by clothes, they let their bodies speak without a gesture or a word. That's the power of the female body.
Right. And the difference between men and women is something that comes up in this book as well. I like the way that this poem conveys the kind of the action orientedness of men versus women just being, and their power is just in their being.
Well,
And
you
go ahead.
you mentioned one poem earlier where there's a reference to Lincoln. You
Hmm.
know, Lincoln's natural mother, Nancy Hanks, who is related to Tom Hanks, by the way, the actor.
Oh, interesting.
Uh, Nancy Hanks died when he was 8. He had an older sister, Sarah, who died as a teenager.
Right.
Okay. His father, Tom Lincoln, at that time when she died, had 2 children, Sarah and Abraham Lincoln. And he needed somebody to raise them because he was a farmer in Indiana. So he went back to Illinois, to Kentucky. There was a widow, proposed to her. She had 3 children. She accepted. She came back. And she literally fell in love with Abraham Lincoln. She gave him the King James Version of the Bible. She gave him Aesop's Fables. She gave him Pilgrim's Progress. She taught him how to read and write.
Right.
Now, I asked an audience once, I said, you know what her name was? I said, I didn't know.
Hmm.
One person said, I think I know. Her name was Sarah Johnson Bush when she was married. Sarah Johnson. All right, now just think about it. Had that woman not done what she'd done, Abraham Lincoln would never have gone to law school. He'd never been a lawyer, never been elected, never been president. And had he not been president, we would not be the country we are right now. All because of one woman whose name nobody knows.
Right. Yeah.
And if she came back from the dead, that would be the way she'd want it.
Yeah.
You went up to her and said, you did a great job, Sarah. She said, oh, come on.
Well, that's what I was, that's kind of what I was saying before I introduced you onto the show, about, why I'm happy if women listen, if mothers listen to this, this show, because their role is so important. And I would love to know that I'm assisting them in some way.
Mothers, you say, are listening.
Yeah. Well, I hear from moms,
So I'm a great believer. I think now that I'm an old salt, uh, I think women are the stronger gender.
well, yeah, I mean,
They're capable of sacrifices that are unmentionable, but influential in the best sense.
right.
And they, if they're doing something for somebody they love, that's the reward. They don't want it publicized. You don't put a mother's stamp on a face on a stamp. You don't name a building after her. Men
Mhm.
like that. Women shy away from that. It spoils
Right.
what they've done. It literally spoils it. And yeah, I've come to that conclusion. They have, and they have, I think, a deeper sense of life in many ways because women are verbs. Women are men are nouns, but women are verbs because life is happening within them all the time.
You mentioned these body parts of these sculptures, but it's not in a prurient way at all. And it's in a way that's a tribute to the dignity of women. And that's something that art can do with the human body. Actually, you have a whole other poem about different painters their approach to nude paintings of women. But that's something that this poem got across in a really kind of understated way. But yeah, just you know the way that a sculpture can change how we see into something less uh exploitative, or whatever word you want to use.
Yeah, it's statuesque. I mean, it's undeniable.
Mike had another question that I'd like to put to you. He wanted to know about your formation at Notre Dame in the 1940s. I'll just read his question. What kind of cultural formation did you get at Notre Dame? What were the emphases? How many parts Catholic to how many parts American?
I am extremely indebted to Notre Dame. Had it not been for Notre Dame, let me put it this way. The tuition at Notre Dame when I went there, I had a scholarship given to me by a doctor here in Pittsburgh named Leo O'Donnell, to whom I'm forever indebted. But the tuition at Notre Dame in 1945 was $350 a semester. Room, board, tuition, and laundry.
Wow.
That's $750 a year. Now it's almost 70,000 a year.
Yeah.
Who can go? Except
Right.
the wealthy or people that'll be in debt forever.
Yeah.
But when I went there, Notre Dame was still roughly for lower middle class students. I never went to I think I went to one dance when I was at Notre Dame, because I really went there just to get an education. And I had some great teachers in English, particularly a fellow named Frank O'Malley, Dick Sullivan. There were a number of them who were unique at that time. We had a major course called The Philosophy of Literature, in which literature was no longer just considered belles-lettres. It was something that gave a vision of man himself. That's what you should get from literature. And we wrote, and it was just I can't be grateful enough. Not all the courses were that. I mean, a lot of them were just regular,
Right.
history and so forth. But the transformative courses were transformative.
And would you say they were transformative in a distinctively Catholic way, as Mike was wondering?
In the way you understand the Catholic imagination, in that sense.
Did that shape your approach to poetry?
Well, in a way, yes, and in a way, no, because I didn't begin to write poems. I wrote a couple of poems at Notre Dame that were terrible. And then when I was in the Marine Corps, I wrote poems just to keep my sanity. But only one was any good. And it wasn't until much later that I tried my hand at it. But, you write poetry when you can't get out of it. But if you sit there and say, I'm going to write a poem at 8 o'clock tonight, go out and get a cup of coffee. I mean, go to a movie, do something else. It's like a forced marriage. It just doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. To quote one of your poems that you read before. Do you mind reading the poem Chipmunkian?
I have a number of poems in this book about that are prompted by animals. But the chipmunk is one of the most concise animals I've ever seen. No wasted motion, compact, busy. And as I say in the poem, I've never in my life seen a dead, tired, or fat chipmunk. So here's the poem, part one. He follows his nose to anything that smells edible. He squats like a catcher, clutches a nut, and munches. When he tunnels for one. Never wasting a step, he knows exactly what's ahead, behind, above. With cheeks plumped or slack, he shows how cheeks can store the nut he munched. Why ask if chipmunks serve a purpose other than the perfect way they munch and store? At least they prove perfection at ground level or below is possible. Part two. Seeing a single chipmunk dead, fat, or asleep is rare. They have no time for such. Right now or what's next is all they know. Compact as a changed purse, they nose the ground, glance up, dart left, skitter or flex erect. Dinosaurs have gone to extinction. Hippos are soon to follow. Chipmunks foretell how the meek shall inherit the earth.
That is a delightful poem, and the phrase "the not yet munched" is a very Hazoian construction. that's like very typical of your syntax, and it is compact in itself.
What seems, what is. Not that it matters. Skyscrapers in Hudson Yards may dwarf the desert towers in the Emirates. So what? All those who batten on irrelevance can feast on that. Let rocketeers rename the moon, establish malls on Mars, and conjure floating cities in the sky. What difference will it make to killers in uniform who boast of bombs that prophesy extinction? It seems if soldiery is the norm, then wartime killing will stay the alibi for murder. It seems unending. As one who thinks that love and all its bravery can mock the follies of this world, I see how disappearance lets the unforgettable endure. What lasts recalls what's lost. My wife's smile was love and bravery combined. It made our kind's unkindness something to defy. The world is less without her, and so am I.
That poem makes a beautiful, unexpected turn from its sardonic opening, but I love the lines, the little comments in there, the way they break up the rhythm of the poem. In particular, the line "It seems unending" is a great transition on a rhythmic level as well as conceptually, because then you get to what persists.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a beautiful turn there. And again, you get this theme that we've been discussing of kind of the something that's past and yet is still present, almost because it's past in a way, because it's a complete experience.
Mhm. I'd like to conclude, if I may, with a poem that you didn't name, but I like it because it's, how shall I say, it's not sarcastic, but it's whimsical enough not to be dismissed lightly.
Okay.
It's called When Being Rude Seems Right.
Oh, good.
Whenever he says, I'm really 25, not 26, because I was sick for a year, we smile. That's just his way. If he meets someone who says, how do you do? He answers, do what? Whether asked or not, he claims, no one visits a rest room to rest. Unfazed by football millionaires, he murmurs, boy men at play for pay. Regarding fashion, burlesque with a price tag. His opinion of beards, they hide the face. Of stubble, someone too lazy to shave. Of tattoos, skin-deep doodles. Of modern poetry, sociology in stanzas. Mocked and dismissed because he offends, he says, each day we're here to be offended. His thoughts on war, everyone loses. And peace, really? And life, it's what we're missing.
Is that inspired by a particular person?
Yes. You know, he was a student, fellow student of mine at Notre Dame, and he began, they were each of us were in a speech class, had to give a talk. And his first line was, I'm 20, I would be 21, but I was sick for a year. And he said it without a smile. And we kept thinking, what do you mean by that?
That's great.
After that, he had the audience in his hand.
Well, that's another of your poems sort of filled with little pithy sayings, which is an interesting way of putting together a poem, but it conveys a unified personality. Sam, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time once again. It was overdue to have you return.
Anytime. I enjoyed talking to you. It might be an appropriate ending. It's called Responses.
Okay.
Trying to define a peninsula, one historian settled for almost nearly an island. Somehow that sounded better than the usual. Asked how he felt during bouts of diarrhea, one boy answered, like I was sitting on an arrow. Ordered to retire after having spared his supervisors the scandal they deserved, he had no option but silence. His ongoing penance was to pray daily for the Jesuit order. Informed that his Renault was totaled, he heard the medic ask him how he felt. Malheureusement, bien. Injured or not, the French give irony its due. Ever the envier, Iago called the total embrace of lovers the beast with two backs. The lovers ignored and pitied him. Rhetoric, said Yeats, is the will trying to do the work of the imagination. Don't send a poem, John Chardy warned, on a prose errand. Cruelty, noted Thornton Wilder, is a failure of the imagination. All three were speaking differently alike. Wounded by dementia, a retired linebacker said, anyone who plays for pay is earning profit for the owners. Then he said it again because he forgot he'd said it. Informed that Cardinal Ottaviani opposed his reforms, Pope John countered, if he is telling the truth, we should listen. Ottaviani said nothing more. Invited to the States after receiving the Nobel Prize, Wisława Szymborska politely responded, Madame Szymborska will come when she is younger.
All right. Thanks again, Sam. This was really fun.
Thanks, Tom. Good luck on the music.
Thank you. So to everybody listening, thank you for listening to the show, especially to the longtime listeners. If you're new to the show and just came for this episode, I urge you to subscribe either to our YouTube channel or on whatever podcast app you listen on. And if you'd like to support us, because we run entirely on donations, you can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. And I pray for all of our donors and all of our listeners, even the ones who don't donate daily. Thanks for listening.